Hey everyone, it's Colin with Legalized Mystery Productions. Thank you for joining me and welcome. And today we're going to start the Space Wolf tutorial using a Primaris Redemptor Dreadnought. And I'm excited. I love this scheme. It's one of, I think, my best schemes that I've come up with. Um, if you haven't seen it, it's more of a Horus Heresy inspired scheme. I really am not a huge fan of the powder blue that GW does for their Space Wolves. It just doesn't look mean enough. And I remember reading one of the Horus Heresy books where their armor was described as the color of storm clouds. And storm clouds have a lot of purple and a lot of blue in them. And so I incorporated that into the color scheme using purple in the shadows and using blue for the highlights. Also to get the blue in there so that it does, kind of register as Space Wolves with that blue gray. So it's a very dark, very menacing gray, I think. And then we offset it with this really rich and vibrant, warm yellow, and I think it just looks really, really good. This tutorial series is exciting because I'm going to be incorporating a lot of the topics that I've already covered on the Patreon, but also exploring some new territory with weathering specifically. We're going to be doing some oils. We're going to be doing some enamel work, some streaking, some chipping, and then, at the end doing some snow basing. So, it's going to cover a lot of ground. It's going to be a longer tutorial series, but, there's going to be a lot of good topics that we're going to cover here. So I'm super excited. First things first is just prepping the model and getting it ready for the initial kind of assault. So we're using the Redemptor. And this is the easy to build Redemptor. I really love this kit, for what, $35. It's a great, great, great value. So, the arms just twist off, which is fine because I'm actually going to be doing those separate. So, it's good that they're easy to just put off to the side. And then I've undercoated the whole model in Vallejo Model Air Whole Red. And this is just a really nice base for larger chipping. It's kind of a rusty, kind of old rust, brownish, reddish color. If we were really going to go crazy on the rust, and like if we were doing Nurgle or something like that, I'd do some more variation in the undercoat, but we're not doing that with this. We don't want the Dreadnought to look neglected and rusty and decrepit. We just want to look like it hasn't been tuned up in a little while, and that it's, some paint has been chipped through just battle and wear and tear. But we don't want it to look just flat out neglected. So, because the Space Wolves do have, a lot of pride. So it's not going to be like rusty and falling apart, but we do want to show kind of that layer underneath the paint. And this is a really good color to do that. So just a full base coat over black primer of the whole red, and really we're ready to go. So I'm going to set the Gatling cannon arm off to the side, and we're going to start with doing the parts that are going to be yellow. So it's just going to be yellow shoulder. So this shoulder pad is going to be yellow, and this knee is going to be yellow as well. And we do that partially to balance it. So we can't have just this shoulder pad yellow and the rest of it gray. It would just look kind of off kilter. So we're going to do this shoulder pad yellow. We also don't want yellow everywhere, right? So we're going to do this shoulder pad yellow, and then we're going to do this knee yellow. And then those will kind of balance across the model, and the rest of the model will be gray. So first things first is we're going to set the chipping. And for this, I'm not going to use chipping fluid. I'm going to be using the liquid mask technique that I showed in the easy chipping tutorial. And I'm doing that because to paint the yellow, I'm going to have to apply primer and I'm going to have to apply like 3 different colors of paint with a couple coats of a couple of those colors. So through primer and like 4 or 5 coats of paint, chipping fluid is going to lose some of its utility. You can do salt chipping. Salt chipping works really well as well. Salt chipping is tough on such a small area though. So it's tough to get like the hairspray and salt technique. Like it's tough to hairspray, just the knee pad. So what I like to do in those situations is get some liquid mask. I use Mr. Masking Soul from Mr. Hobby. I love this stuff. I think it's fantastic. And the reason I'm doing this is because this will rub off under like 5 coats of paint. You just rub it with your thumb and it'll peel right off, and it'll actually look like actual chipping because it will pull some of that paint off as well. So I'm getting the little applicator here, and then I've torn just a piece of plucked foam. So I'm going to load up the foam a little bit. And this stuff dries really, really fast. So you want to think about, where is this shoulder going to be impacted in battle? It's probably going to be on the front facing. Those are too circular for my liking, so I'm going to dab off to the side. So I'm not loving that. I think those are too circular. But the great thing about liquid mask is you can just let it dry a little bit, and you can just wipe it right off. So wipe it off, and then I patted this on dry off to the side, and then I'm going to pick up a little bit more, but I'm going to pat it off to the side a little bit more than I did the first time. So I'm going to come back. So you're imagining this thing's getting impacted more from the front and more kind of towards the bottom. Impacts aren't really going to happen on like the top of the shoulder pad that much, right? So we want kind of heavier chipping towards the bottom. That's better. See how much more subtle that is, how much more kind of angular that is. It's not round, right? Those are too small. So there we go. That's what I want. I want that irregular. That's why we're using the sponge. If I wanted circles, I would use a paintbrush. So we're going to concentrate on the kind of this lower area here. And a little bit here at the back as well. And then the edges of the pad, we're also going to concentrate. And then we can do a couple just, kind of chunky. Oops, that pulled up. See, stuff dries so fast it'll pull up when you keep sponging. But that's okay. It's a wonderful thing about liquid mask is how easy it is to undo what you're working on and go back. So we can do kind of a chunky, and that looks pretty good. I'm going to leave it at that. Maybe a little bit. I kind of want to do a bigger chunk here at the front too. And just make sure that we get a nice big chip in there. So we're going to leave it at that. Put that off to the side. And then the knee, you imagine this is going to get a lot of wear and tear just walking around, knocking into things, going through, barricades or whatever. The knees and the legs, and we'll be covering this more too when we come back and do the chipping for the legs and such. We're really going to want to concentrate in those areas. So that's it for the liquid mask. I may have gone a little bit too fine, may have gone a little bit too soft on that, but we won't know until after we've done We won't know until after we've done the paint. So, you know, it's in the hands of the paint gods now. But I'd rather go too light than too heavy. What I don't want is just to do just a ton of liquid mask and then have it look just too much. That's what I definitely do not want. So now I'm going to get some white primer, airbrush primer. I use Stylin' Wrens, but you know, there are a bunch of options out there. And I'm just very lightly going to prime this shoulder. Everywhere that I'm going to paint yellow, I'm going to prime white. And I'm doing this because the yellow will not cover the armor brown at all. So a couple thin coats. There we go. And then a couple thin coats on the knee. And I'm going to come back and mask the knee and the shoulder and respray that armor brown before I do the gray. But there's no reason not to be a little careful. And then I'm going to be using same yellow recipe that I use for the Imperial Fists. Because if you have a good recipe and it works, you know, use it. Use it in different places. You don't have to come up with something new every time you go to paint a bottle. There's just no reason to, you know, try and reinvent the wheel. You know, every time you come up with a different scheme. If you have a yellow recipe that works and you're painting, you know, Imperial Fist and you're painting, you know, Iyanden Eldar, you know, use the same recipe if you want. Nobody's going to fault you. If it's a good recipe and it looks good, that's really all that matters. And you like painting it, that's really all that matters. So here we're going to be using Vallejo Model Air Yellow Ochre. And just giving an overall base coat of the yellow ochre. And that's not quite as, that's a little more electric yellow on the camera than it is in person. I mean, it's definitely yellow, but it's not that yellow. Let me see if I can adjust it a little bit. Just if you have these paints and you're trying it and you're like, wow, that looks way more yellow than mine, just know that it's a little richer. It's a little richer yellow than that in person. And we're doing the yellow before the gray because it's just way, way easier to do this yellow and then mask it off than it is, and then paint the gray, you know, over it and around it, than it is to do the gray and then have to come back and like mask off the entire Dreadnought just to do the yellow parts afterwards. So we definitely don't. So that's a little closer. That's better. It's just really popping against that armor brown. So the next step in the yellow recipe is to use what I call secret sauce for yellow, which is this burned flesh from Game Air. And we're going to do the shadows. So we're kind of doing this out of order. Typically, you want to go base coat, wash, not wash, but shadow, mid, high, shadow, mid-tone, highlight. But with yellow, it works a lot better for me, for this recipe anyway. For yellow, I find it works a lot better to do the mid-tone and then come back and add the shadows and the highlights. So we're going to come from underneath, just directly underneath, and spray this burned flesh. And then, if you remember from the Redemptor Dreadnought grayscale tutorial, sorry, I just totally drew a blank there. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be doing panel modulation. So this is going to be a high out on this edge, and then we're going to go light to dark on these panels, but then that's going to reverse and go dark to light on the front and rear panels. So you want to keep this kind of straight on for the shadow, making sure that when we're spraying, we can't see the side panel because we want that to stay clean, right? So we're spraying this way, so it just goes past that corner and it keeps that side panel clean and it keeps the back panel clean. And that's probably good for a shadow. And then we're going to come back here and turn it so that when we spray the shadow in there, that we keep the front part of that panel clean. And those are lining up a little too well, so we're actually just going to deepen that shadow on the back, and we're going to glaze that down. But we don't want those to meet at the same place. We don't want them to be just like cookie cutter opposites, because then it'll look a little unnatural. So just kind of deepen the shadow there, and then you can see those are blending together a little bit more. So that's perfect. And then just kind of getting the back of these panels with that burned flesh and the back of that trim with the burned flesh. So now we have kind of the basic shading on that shoulder. Sorry. And make sure it wasn't my wife or my kid's school or something like that. And then here on the knee, we're going to make sure to get the side and the underneath of the knee and coming up about halfway on that shadow. And then the same on the side here. I don't know what happened right there. I probably just grabbed it or something, but we're just going to leave it. And at some stage of painting, our weathering will sort that out. Not worried about that right now. So it's a nice thing about doing weathering is when you spot something like that, you can just kind of say, well, get it when we get there. And then now the gold yellow to really add that rich, super rich, vibrant yellow to the scheme. So we're going to come through, and this glaze, now this stuff is super transparent, and this glaze is going to ease that transition between the shadow and the light. And this is because we're not just going to do a highlight. with this yellow. We're going to bring this yellow and glaze it all the way down, like halfway through this shadow, to really give a nice transition all the way down. Not like a typical highlight. A typical highlight, I would just kind of do the top third here. But because this is such a stark transition, we want to ease that transition with the golden yellow because it's so transparent. And you'll see what I mean. It's going to add. So if you were to just do a highlight, you see how rich that yellow got. But if we keep going with it into that golden yellow or into that burned flesh, you can see how much that softened that transition between the highlight and the shadow. And that's exactly what we want. That looks really, really nice. So again, coming back here, kind of the highlight, and then getting in. We're not covering the whole shadow. We still want that dark shadow back there. But you can see how much it eases that transition. We'll do it here again. And it really just smooths everything out, gives us a nice, beautiful transition from the really rich yellow on top and that burned flesh there on the bottom. And then we're going to come and hit the top of this as well, because we do want that to be darker, but you can see we got some nice shadows, some nice differentiation from the yellow here. So same thing over here, hit the side, hit the top, hit the other side, and then the front. And it really eased that transition on the knee pad. That looks great. Super happy with that. Just hitting it with some air. Hitting it with some air to dry it out. And then now for the fun part. And I'm going to use my super technical tool here. Make sure my hand is dry. I'm going to use my soup very, very lightly. I am not rubbing this very hard, because what will happen is I'll start smearing paint and rubbing paint off. And it doesn't have to be very hard at all. So I'm just going to come through with my finger. And if it's not releasing initially, I'm just going to move on, and I can always come back and kind of let it rest a little bit. But once it starts to go, it just comes right off. There we go. Now I'm sure the chipping fluid would have worked. It's not that I don't think it would have worked. It just, I think this works most reliably, and I think it also gives like a really, really natural looking chipping effect, and it's really straightforward, and it's really easy to do. So easy to do, natural looking is a good combo in my book. That's interesting, but it works. So because we primed white before we did the yellow, so like if we didn't prime white, these would just be yellow, but because we did prime white, kind of come in here with this is clean sponge here. See if we can get a little more grip on a couple places. There we go. There are little highlights almost little highlights on the chipping. But you can see like that looks great. Not to toot my own horn, but that looks really natural. That looks just like just quality chipping right there. And you can see we concentrated on the lower area here and a little on the back there. God, that looks good. I'm really happy with that. A little bit on the upper area. And then we'll put a transfer in here. You know, we'll set transfer in there, and then we'll weather that as well. But man, I am super happy with that. It's hard not to be happy with that. So now we're going to do the knee pad as well. And this had some bigger areas of chipping. And here you can really see where that primer kind of shows through. And that's okay. There are a couple spots there that I'm not particularly happy with. And I'll show you what we should do. To see, like, looking, like the chipping itself looks good, but if you look in the middle of this area here, there's a lot of white in there. And I'm not too happy about that. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get some of that whole red. And I'll be going over this with another layer of chipping, but when we do the sponge chipping portion, but I want to make sure that I'm at least, oops, I don't want that. Okay. I want to make sure that I'm at least most of the way happy with the chipping that's already there. And this whole red is very transparent, so it's not really going over that white too well. And some of that white is fine. I just didn't want those big chips in the middle of those big kind of globs of white in the middle of the chipped area. Just didn't look natural. So I'm just I'm stippling on this armor brown. And that looks better. And like I said, that's not, like, I wouldn't necessarily want to leave it like that. I colored outside the lines a little bit right here. But that's okay. That's no reason to give up. That's no reason to kind of scrap this whole weathering idea. I am really happy with that. But with this kind of mistake here, and it wasn't really a mistake. Like, I didn't do anything wrong necessarily. It just didn't work exactly how I wanted it to, and that's super common when you're painting. So it's not a mistake. So when something unexpected happens, let's put it that way. When something like unexpected like that happens, and there's a fix. You could just go back with the original kind of chipping color and kind of fill it in like I did. But like here, it's a little bit more rounded than I would like, and I colored outside the lines a little bit right here, which makes it a different color and kind of stands out a little bit. So it's not ideal, right? It's not how I would really like it, like this is, right? This turned out really, really well. This turned out really well, but there was a little snafu there. It's not a reason to like give up or scrap the yellow knee pad or strip the model or anything like that. We have a lot of distance between where we are now and when we're going to call this knee pad finished. There's a long way to go. Excuse me. There's a long way to go between where we're now and finishing this off. And between the sponge chipping and highlighting and the weathering, we're going to have plenty of opportunities to smooth that out and integrate it. And you won't even know that had happened in the initial first step of painting this model. You just won't. It just, like, unless you were the one painting it, you would never know. Hopefully, if we do the next steps well. So So don't worry about that. Don't, if you reach a roadblock like that, that's fine. It happens. It happens to everybody. It happens to us all. So, the important thing is, there are ways to kind of dig yourself out of it and move forward. When you're doing this kind of weathering and stuff like that, there's a lot of opportunity. If you're going for a really clean, crisp scheme, then we wouldn't have been doing the chipping in the first place. So, there are definitely times when, stuff goes sideways and you just have to kind of reset. But this is not one of those times. So don't sweat it. Just kind of get it back to, like, it doesn't look terrible, right? It looks okay. It's good enough to go forward. So now what I'm going to do, I use Liquitex gloss varnish. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to gloss varnish those areas that we just painted, the yellow areas. And I'm doing this I'm doing this to seal it, basically. But I'm also doing this because I need to mask it off. And it's going to be masked for a little while because we have to basically mask it and then kind of redo the armor brown on the parts that I'm going to paint gray, and then paint all the gray. So this is going to be masked for a little while. So I really need, the longer it's masked and the tape kind of sits there, or the liquid mask sits there, I just don't want there to be any opportunity really for paint to get pulled up or discolored, it won't get discolored, but I just don't want anything to go wrong with the masking. And what the gloss varnish is going to do is it's going to lower the surface tension for the tape. And for the liquid mask, it's going to make it a lot easier to remove the tape and the liquid mask. It kind of forms a protective barrier for what we've already done, but it also just makes it that much easier to pull the tape off after we're done doing the gray parts. So I'm going to let this cure. I'm going to let this dry. I'm not just going to slap the tape on there, immediately after applying the gloss varnish. So I'm going to let that cure for a little while, half hour. I'm not going to leave this for 24 hours or something crazy, but it's still tacky. So I definitely have to let that cure before I do some of the masking. Same with the knee pad. But I'm going to mask those off, and I'm going to reset the I'll mask off the shoulder. I'll do the liquid mask for the knee because it's on camera next time, so you can see how I do the liquid mask. But that is a great start. I'm excited. So a little bit of liquid mask chipping and a little bit of yellow, and we're off to the races. So part 2, I'm going to come back, liquid mask the knee real quick, and then we'll do the star of the show, which is the gray armor. So thanks. Hope you found it useful. If you have any questions, please leave a comment, and we'll see you again very soon.